Hi everybody, how are we doing? It's great to be able to be a part of this positive pedagogy presentation. I'm myself a colleague of Dr. Stephen Harvey at Ohio University as a faculty member here, but my role today is to introduce the next presentation and moderate that with Dr. Clayton Kuchlik, who is going to be doing something related to positive pedagogy and its application to the sport of baseball. So before Clayton gets cracking on, I'm just going to introduce him right this moment. So Clayton is a clinical assistant professor in the Master of Arts in Sports Coaching program at the University of Denver. He teaches a variety of courses spanning motor learning and pedagogy, biomechanics, sport technology, and kinesiology. His research interests center on coach learning and enhancing athlete performance. And Clayton has been a professor of coach development for the last 6 years after serving a 9-year stint as a collegiate baseball coach. So we're really excited to hear from you today, Clayton, and I'll pass it over to you once the slide deck gets up and running.
Thanks, Ashley, for the wonderful introduction. The last name's Cook and Lick, for all those wondering how to pronounce that. So thanks for the great introduction. And over the next 12, 14 minutes or so, I'll talk a little bit about my previous experiences, my interactions and use of positive pedagogy in a game that I used in baseball practice. And then I'll show you some other variations to the game and some reflective insights. So do we get that slide pulled up there yet? Or
Yeah, I think Tristram's just pulling it up, Clayton.
So when we get that slide back up, we can, we can go to the second slide, and I'll start just to keep it moving until we get that going. So some of my previous experiences, both my parents were physical educators and phys ed teachers, coaches at the collegiate and high school level for 30 plus years. So they had a really big phys ed background. And, you know, I had two brothers as well. So we grew up with lots of games, creating our own games. And there was a lot had to do with my parents providing some of that instruction as with their physical education background. I too went into elementary education, sport pedagogy. I was playing collegiate baseball, played a little professional baseball, then got into collegiate coaching, where I got my master's degree, master's of education, some more pedagogy being integrated in there, and then my PhD is on learning pedagogy, and all the while I'm taking these courses, and I'm coaching baseball and coach. You know, some may argue that, you know, baseball, you know, is America's pastime, yada yada yada. So there's a lot of tradition there, but some of the things I was seeing were that a lot of the literature on learning and learning through problem solving and making corrections and you know, learning through problems that were contradictions to a lot what we were doing that I was seeing on a regular basis. For example, in baseball, things are typically in blocks. Like batting practice, 5 sets of 5, you know, 5 balls away, 5 middle, 5 in. Some of the same things with fielding and infield practice and pitching as well, you know, blocks as well. So there were lots of contradictions. I also noticed that in the literature, some of the more drilling fell short on softer skills. These were problems that I was experiencing in my direct context. So I was looking to more games-based approaches, which you know, was more prominent in field-based sports. I liked what I was seeing, like with advancing learning and overcoming some of the you know, working through problems with athletes and creating pedagogical strategies in practice environments to do that. So the next slide, go ahead. You know, so some of the things that I was experiencing were positive things that I was seeing in the literature with positive pedagogy. For example, I had some athletes that were struggling with transferring technical and tactical skills over to the games. You know, I was always struggling with empowerment. You know, some of the teams we had some interpersonal and teamwork issues, and these were all things that positive pedagogy was, you know, was showing to have some positive effects for it, and also, you know, games-based approaches there as well. You know, and creativity, problem solving. Again, I think we just got so structured in you know, some of our baseball practices, that these were some limiting things that, hey, look, this might be a great opportunity for positive pedagogy. Next slide, please. So just real quick, you know, I know this whole event's on positive pedagogy, so I'm not going to talk about a lot of the fundamentals, but these were some of the key concepts that I was drawing from. And again, the tough thing for me was, you know, games-based approaches. And that's why I liked positive pedagogy, could have opened it up a little bit to, you know, not to baseball, and which is a stop and start. So we could have some use some games for the integration of tactical technical skill with tactical context, the manipulations of space, time, and using constraints and rules to get there with that. And then the use of questioning. I don't know if you guys can see the last bullet there, but also using questioning. So something I wanted to use for this particular game. Next slide, please. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, yeah, so yeah, go back one slide, sorry. Yeah, okay, so some of the foundational game, you know, I developed these rules. Again, I was struggling with how to create a game in a stop and start sport like baseball. But my pedagogical background told me to start with objectives, learning objectives. So, you know, for this example, I'll just start with the one, and then in a couple slides later, I'll show you how it kind of evolved into other games as well, where we're constantly changing this. So, you know, for the first game, we kind of, you know, I wanted to work on hitting with scoring in men in scoring position, and then I had a defensive objective, which was working on relays, you know, from outfield to infield, yada yada yada, didn't matter, just, you know, in general relayings. So I kind of restructured the game where I added points for accomplishing each objective. So if we hit with a man in scoring position, it was a point, and also if we executed this relay, it was a point. This is much different than the traditional game of baseball, where you only really score with you only really score with when you're on offense. So I made 5-on-5 time games. Again, we made a time limit here, which also was a big contrast in comparison to traditional baseball. The other kind of two key, I'd say 2 or 3 key rules to this game were that defensive players all had a baseball in their hand, and the purpose of this was so they were able to throw and you know, exchange balls, work on throwing that way. And I didn't feel comfortable with them using wiffle balls, which is that next bullet there, where we played with wiffle balls. And in particular, we used this wiffle ball that had a harder surface, pickleball, wiffle ball. And I'll show you some other constraints that we did, but that's a comparison to another wiffle ball that has the holes in the top, is a little bit slower. And then also I had 2 pitches, back-to-back balls, to run for the hitting team, and then a miss equaled a swing and miss was a run for the defensive team. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is kind of the setup of the game. I just wanted to draw a pick, was set up a little bit like a wiffle ball. There's 45-foot lines. The pitcher had a line that, you know, was 40 feet. The rules kind of were that the defensive team could, you know, set up in any sequence they wanted. There's that little box that I have down at the bottom that, you know, was a net that was kind of a strike zone. And again, we had that rule of 2 pitches. So there were no bases in this particular scenario. We never really did that. It was just, you know, the game was moving. So they were 8-minute halves. I had some structured questions that came in, you know, once the team switched sides. So defense went to offense. And so we were constantly scoring on the defensive side, and then also on the offense side there. Again, changing, the defense could change their setup. So in this particular example, remember I said that the rule was hitting with men in scoring position. So the key part is you can define as a coach, or your team can collaboratively, define what that counts as a run. So in our case, for hitting with men in scoring position, we included any line drive, a ball that doesn't bounce past the pitcher's mound. If it was a pop-up, it was out of bounds, you didn't get a run, or you didn't get a point for that. For the defensive team, if they fielded any of the balls, any of the, they had their glove in their one hand and a live ball in the other. So when the ball came, we were working on relays, fielded it, whatever the scenario was, but then they relayed to each person. So the went from one defensive player, D to the D, and then back to the pitcher. So, once those, yeah, there you go. Thank you. So once the happened, the ball went back. If it was successful, that equaled a point there. So again, we're scoring on both sides, and the highest combined score wins. And we kept it at 8-minute halves. Next slides, please, and I'll wrap up with some of these manipulations and reflections here on the next two slides. But for this, for some of the manipulations, I just wanted to show that we evolved this to address different objectives in the collegiate baseball setting, to address other things. And I was quite amazed at some of the things that were, that the athletes were doing. O2 hitting, again, you can define how this counts as a run, but these were kind of the objectives. Opposite and pull side hitting with runners on first, just some examples there. And then defensive, objectives, or how they would run, would be fielding backhands or forehands only, which was really interesting. And you can see some of the other points there, double plays, different arm angles, charging balls versus moving backs. And those were really interesting because, when you add that constraint of, okay, you can only field the ball backhand successfully, and that counts as your defensive run or point. I mean, athletes were being extremely creative with their bodies and still, and performing backhands that we would never have them do in a drill or activity. Why? Because partially of our constraints and some of my dominant baseball coaching knowledge, some of these things were like, hey, why can't we do that? Yes, you can. We can have athletes throw in different arm angles. It's going to be okay. And I'll talk a little bit that in the next slide too. Changing wiffle balls and bats for changing speed. So I mentioned the hard wiffle ball. It's based out of a pickleball. It's a little bit harder plastic. I'd also add that we also took tennis balls that sometimes drilled a hole in them. One or two holes, multiple holes, the more holes the slower it got. But if we wanted to speed it up, depending on the rules, the objectives, offensive, defensive objectives, then we could do that. And then also changing bats. Sometimes we use broomsticks, which would be, actually add a little bit more juice, to the balls in comparison to regular bats is another option there. And then that next slide there, or not next slide, excuse me, next bullet, adding and subtracting to the game. Sorry, go back one more. Adding, subtracting time to the game, depending on the objectives, and then changing the shape, and then changing the numbers were also critical. So changing the shape was kind of interesting. So sometimes we would be working on hitting the ball up through the middle. So we narrowed the field, right? Anything that was out of bounds didn't count, right? And then my defensive players might have been, the objective there was, might be working on communication in these tighter spaces. So just some example there. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, so on this next slide, just some of my reflections, and I mentioned this briefly, is like the dominant coaching knowledge and tradition with baseball was challenging and exciting too, because I was able to think creatively, and this was stuff that had never been done before. I haven't seen it. I had been coaching, I played professionally, I played at the collegiate level. We never played that. It was typically the same structures of general baseball practice that was adopted in almost all these levels. So thinking creatively, like I had mentioned, like some athletes, only moving forward to field balls or doing things that like we normally wouldn't have in a drill, like having athletes throw at different arm angles. Like, holy cow. but wrap your head around that, like, oh yes, it's going to be okay. They can, work and learn and work and practice those things of throwing different arm angles. I had desires to constantly tell rather than ask questions, so I had to be really careful about that. Just adopting the idea of learning through mistakes, which is a little bit different than in comparison to like drilling, where we're kind of sometimes to some degree, depending on how the drill's structured, it's repetitive, it's repeating things we might already know. And then at times athletes were skeptical, like at first, and then they evolved a little bit, but they eventually got, just again, like, coach, like this is fun. And, normally we don't normally do this type of activities there. And then lastly, just really thinking about asking good questions to prompt experimentation was challenging too. Sometimes you just, like taking a couple seconds and really thinking about like where this question can go with your group, I think is something that took some time and is a skill that we need to practice even as coaches and thinking about it as coach educator side too. Anyway, I'll take any questions and we'll go from there. So thanks.
Thank you for that, Clayton. Very insightful. And we do have some numerous questions in the chat. I'm going to combine two questions right now with Glenn and Kyle. Glenn, kind of going off that last bullet point, Clayton, has asked kind of how you would approach questioning with your session. And Kyle, a little bit more specifically, has mentioned that you talked about structured questioning. And is this something that is an integral part of that approach? And basically, how many questions are you kind of unstructured versus structured in any given session? So I think they wanted to know a little bit more about how you go about questioning and what your thought process is behind it, specifically in the practice.
Yeah, in the beginning stages on this first one, when I first started developing the game, I had thought about note cards, put a couple on there, so it was much more structured. I was working with collegiate athletes, but we did it 2 or 3 times, and then it was like, Coach, we don't need your questions anymore. This is halftime. You know what I mean? We know, we have some target areas. We've been playing this for the last 8 minutes. We know where to go. So I backed off the structure there. And then the key point probably to follow up with that, I then started evolving questions on the fly, thinking about them for individual athletes within the games as I was observing. So we had quite a few people. So again, I guess my questioning went more to the individual level as the game evolved that way. Great question. Thanks.
Brilliant. And then Aaron has asked, did the players get the opportunity to come up with their own rules or scoring opportunities as they got comfortable with the idea? And how did that develop as you progressed in your sessions as they got better, Clayton?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like once we get past through that athlete skepticism that I was talking about, like, oh, this is going to be something that, we wound up doing it daily as an integrated block. Now, did we do this, 10 different games across a 3-hour practice? No, but it was an integrated piece where we did it every day and it addressed different objectives there. So as the games got going, I'm trying to bang my up, trying to think about, hey, what are we going to do? I have kind of a plan moving forward, what the next day's plan is, but eventually the athletes started helping out with that, with cues and, hey, coach, how about this one? Because they're paying attention that it's changing each day too. So, yep.
Fantastic. And last question comes from Stuart Curry, who's a professor at the University of Tennessee at Martin. And he said a huge thank you for your presentation, but could you please provide some additional challenges you experienced applying a more games-based approach and athlete-centered approach to coaching baseball? Obviously, it's not very traditional to be that way coaching in baseball. So how did you overcome them challenges that the players might have and even you might have had?
Yeah, this is a great question. And some of those I address with just because baseball was a stop and start sport. And like, again, most of the stuff we were seeing with games-based approaches were field-based and kind of interesting, like the previous presentation on volleyball, which is also to some degree the pace related there. So I think using those manipulations I had on the one slide, it was the second one, third. Anyway, you don't have to need to get to it, but I have the positive pedagogy fundamentals, and I necessarily wasn't so locked in on this has to be a game. It kind of evolved that way, but I took some of those key concepts, and that's what it kind of went in that direction, because I had to think about disrupting this stop-start, and I used time, those space constraints, and the rules as the fundamental manipulations there, rather than strictly I'm going to make a game out of it. It went that direction, but I didn't really intend to go that way when I was starting out. But great question. Thank you.
Love it. And then I guess for the final kind of comment, just from my perspective, Clayton, it was great to listen to that. How did the players react when you did time drills? Obviously, that's very different to baseball. There's no time on it. What was the kind of implication regarding that?
Yeah, good. Another great question, and obviously an observation that I had. We get to this section during the game. It was basically 16 minutes, like I said, 8-minute halves. We kind of did that, and then some we tweaked some things, yada yada yada. No big deal, but it was a flow. Initially, this was skeptical. Then, the game wind up being like the highlight of practice. And then you kind of see this roller coaster ride. But eventually, over time, the energy and some of the excitement that we were having during the game also kind of, oozed into the other drills that, were quite noticeable when you first do this. It's like, oh my God, yeah, these are pretty boring. Do you know what I mean? Like, once you compare it to how you see it, how athletes are having fun, a little, more fun in these other games. So anyway, another great question too.
Well, thank you for that, Clayton. It was very insightful, and I hope the individuals listening on the call can definitely take some away some of them strategies, and especially if there's any baseball coaches, softball coaches on that call as well, which would be great advice and excellent insight. Okay, so thank you for that, and I'm now going to kind of hand it over back to Stephen, who's then going to introduce the next presentation, which I believe is Phil Edwards.